Imagine waking up one morning and discovering something impossible. Nobody in your city has died overnight. Not the 90-year-old woman in the hospital, not the astronaut orbiting Earth. Not the child born with a genetic disease. For the first time in human history, aging has stopped. Scientists have discovered a way to continuously repair the microscopic damage that slowly destroys the human body. Cancer can be detected before it begins. Damaged organs can be rebuilt. Cells can be reset. Death has not disappeared, but aging has. And suddenly, humanity faces a question no civilization has ever had to answer. What happens when one generation doesn't make room for the next? Because living forever may not be the greatest achievement humanity has ever made. It may be the greatest test. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering something impossible. Nobody in your city has died overnight, not the 90-year-old woman in the hospital. Not the astronaut orbiting Earth. Not the child born with a genetic disease. For the first time in human history, aging has stopped. Scientists have discovered a way to continuously repair the microscopic damage that slowly destroys the human body. Cancer can be detected before it begins. Damaged organs can be rebuilt. Cells can be reset. Death has not disappeared, but aging has. And suddenly, humanity faces a question no civilization has ever had to answer. What happens when one generation doesn't make room for the next? Because living forever may not be the greatest achievement humanity has ever made. It may be the greatest test. For thousands of years, human civilizations were built around one unavoidable fact: people die. Ancient Egyptians built monuments for the dead. Romans created elaborate funerary traditions. Kings constructed tombs designed to preserve their names for eternity. Religions promised forms of existence beyond the grave. And ordinary families learned to measure life through generations. A child became an adult. Parents became grandparents. Eventually, the old died. The young inherited their homes, their positions, their knowledge, and their world. That cycle shaped almost everything about human civilization: politics, economics, family, religion, education, even the meaning of time. Human beings have always known that no matter how powerful a person became, eventually another generation would take their place. But imagine that this ancient rule suddenly disappears, not through magic, not through some mysterious fountain of youth. Through engineering. The first real breakthroughs would probably not look dramatic. There would be no single morning when the world wakes up immortal. Instead, researchers would gradually learn to attack the biological processes associated with aging. Cells accumulate damage. DNA suffers mutations. Proteins become dysfunctional. The immune system changes. Stem cells become less effective. Some cells enter dysfunctional states known as senescence, and the body slowly loses its ability to repair itself. Scientists already study many of these mechanisms. The future breakthrough would come when several technologies begin working together. Artificial intelligence could identify biological patterns humans cannot see. Gene editing systems could correct certain mutations. Advanced drugs could selectively remove damaged cells. Regenerative medicine could replace organs. lab-grown tissues could reduce dependence on donors, and microscopic sensors could continuously monitor the body for early signs of disease. None of these technologies by themselves would create immortality. But together, they could potentially transform medicine from something that treats disease into something that continuously maintains the human body. Instead of asking, "How do we cure cancer?" doctors might ask, "How do we prevent these cellular conditions that allow cancer to emerge?" Instead of replacing a failing heart once every few decades, hospitals might routinely regenerate damaged tissue. Instead of accepting declining vision, hearing, muscle strength, and cognitive function as unavoidable consequences of age, medicine might continuously repair them. The human body could become less like a machine that eventually breaks and more like a machine that is constantly serviced. But there would still be a problem: death itself. Even if aging could be controlled, humans would remain vulnerable to accidents, infections, violence, disasters, and catastrophic injuries. Immortality would therefore probably not mean invulnerability. It would mean something more subtle: indefinite biological survival. A person who is 25 might remain biologically 25 for centuries, and that possibility would initially seem almost miraculous. Parents could watch their children grow without fearing that age would separate them. Scientists could spend centuries pursuing a single problem. Artists could work on masterpieces for hundreds of years. Engineers could dedicate entire lifetimes to projects that currently take decades. An astronaut could leave Earth knowing that the mission might take 50 years and still return young. But then something unexpected would happen. People would stop thinking of time as something they had to save. And that could change humanity more profoundly than immortality itself. If you are fascinated by the hidden stories behind history, subscribe to Chronicle Nexus and join us as we uncover the mysteries that shaped our world. At first, the world celebrates. Hospitals become quieter. Retirement homes begin to disappear. The demand for organ transplants collapses. Diseases once associated almost exclusively with old age become increasingly rare. Insurance companies rewrite their models. Governments create new categories of citizenship. Universities discover that some of their professors have been teaching for 100 years. And then the first immortal generation reaches an uncomfortable realization: there is no longer a natural deadline. A 25-year-old no longer has to decide what they want to accomplish before 60. They could change careers at 40. Start a family at 80. Return to school at 120. Build a company at 200. Become an expert in several completely different fields. Human identity begins to stretch across centuries. But human society doesn't stretch as quickly. Consider the simplest problem: population. If people continue being born while very few people die naturally, population rises. At first, governments might encourage smaller families. Some countries might offer enormous financial incentives for people to delay having children. Others could impose strict reproductive policies. The debate would become explosive. Who gets to be born? Who decides? And could any government legitimately tell an immortal person that they are not allowed to have another child? The problem would become even more serious because the planet has limits. Food requires land. Cities require space. Energy requires infrastructure. Fresh water is finite in many regions. And ecosystems cannot simply expand because humans have discovered a way to live longer. So humanity begins looking upward. For centuries, space exploration was driven partly by curiosity and partly by survival. Now there is a new reason: room. The first generation of truly long-lived humans becomes the greatest force behind permanent settlement beyond Earth. Lunar cities become economically viable. Mars stops being described merely as a destination and starts being treated as a second civilization. Orbital habitats become enormous artificial ecosystems. Asteroid mining becomes more attractive because raw materials can be harvested without consuming Earth's limited reserves. And something strange begins happening. Immortality changes the psychology of exploration. Today, a Mars mission is measured in years. For an immortal human, a 10-year journey may feel like an extended chapter of life. A 100-year project no longer sounds absurd. Humanity finally has something previous generations never possessed: time. But time creates another problem: power. Imagine a politician who has been in office for 150 years. A billionaire who accumulated wealth 2 centuries ago and never had to surrender it to the next generation. A corporation whose founder is still alive after 500 years. A military strategist with centuries of experience. A scientist who has personally witnessed technological revolutions that no living human today could comprehend. Immortality could create the most experienced generation in human history. It could also create the most entrenched. Revolutions have historically been driven partly by generational replacement. New ideas replace old ones. New leaders emerge. Old institutions disappear. But what happens when the old never leave? A society of immortal people could become incredibly stable. And dangerously stagnant. The young might eventually ask a terrifying question. Why should we inherit a world controlled by people who were already powerful when our great-great-grandparents were alive? That question could become the political crisis of the century, and then comes the wealth problem. Suppose a person becomes extraordinarily wealthy at 30. They invest intelligently. They own land. They own companies. They acquire intellectual property. Under today's system, fortunes eventually fragment through inheritance, but an immortal billionaire doesn't die. Their wealth compounds. Their companies remain under their control. Their influence survives every election cycle. Over centuries, wealth could become concentrated on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Governments would be forced to reconsider inheritance, taxation, ownership, and corporate control. The concept of retirement might disappear entirely, but something else might disappear with it. The concept of a career. Why spend 40 years becoming a doctor and then retire? An immortal person might become a doctor for 70 years, a historian for another 50, an engineer for a century, and eventually become something nobody has a word for. Human beings would stop organizing their lives around decades. They would organize them around eras. A teenager might say, "I'm still figuring things out," and a 100-year-old might say exactly the same thing. But immortality would not eliminate emotional pain. It could amplify it. Imagine losing someone you love in an accident. You survive. Then 50 years pass, then 100, then 300.
You remember their face perfectly, their voice, their jokes, the way they walked through a room.
But everyone else who knew them is gone. Immortality might preserve memories while destroying the world in which those memories made sense. And eventually, psychologists would encounter a phenomenon never seen before: people carrying centuries of grief, centuries of regret, centuries of trauma.
The human mind evolved to survive a limited lifetime. Would it be capable of carrying 500 years of memories?
Scientists might develop technologies to help: memory augmentation, artificial cognitive assistance, digital archives connected directly to the brain. AI systems capable of organizing centuries of experience. A person could ask their private AI, "What was I doing in the summer of 2147?" and receive an answer instantly. But then another ethical boundary appears. If technology can preserve memory, can it also edit memory? Could a person remove a traumatic experience? Could they erase the memory of a lost child? Could an abusive government manipulate citizens by altering what they remember? The technology that protects humanity from biological death could eventually threaten something just as important: personal identity. And this is where artificial intelligence becomes unavoidable. An immortal civilization would generate an extraordinary amount of information. One person could accumulate 500 years of conversations, experiences, research, photographs, decisions, relationships, and memories. No human brain could consciously manage all of it. AI would become the external memory of civilization. It would know what humanity has forgotten. It would connect discoveries separated by centuries. It might tell a scientist in the 24th century that an experiment resembles something attempted 200 years earlier. It could become a bridge between generations that never naturally disappear. But would humans remain in control? Would you trust an AI with humanity's future? Tell us what you think in the comments. Because an immortal civilization might eventually reach a point where artificial intelligence understands human history better than any individual human possibly could. And that creates a strange inversion. Humans built AI to extend their intelligence. Immortality could make humans dependent on AI simply to manage their own existence. Eventually, the first truly ancient humans would appear. People who were alive when today's world existed. People who remembered the first moon bases. The first artificial general intelligences. The first permanent Mars settlements. They would become living historical archives. A 200-year-old engineer could describe the first orbital construction project from personal memory. A 300-year-old scientist could remember when genetic medicine was primitive. A 400-year-old historian could personally connect the digital age to civilizations that existed before the technology that created modern society. History would no longer be something humans studied. Some humans would have lived through it. And yet, immortality would create a strange paradox. The longer people lived, the more precious new experiences might become. At 25, a person might imagine that they have endless time. At 200, they may realize that endless time is not the same thing as meaningful time. Eventually, even an immortal person could become exhausted, not physically, existentially. Imagine having seen the sunrise 10,000 times, visited every major city, read millions of books, loved dozens of people, experienced technologies rise and disappear, watched languages change, watched nations form and collapse, watched oceans change, watched continents remain. At what point does novelty become difficult? This could create a psychological divide. Some immortal humans might become more adventurous than ever. Others might retreat into artificial realities. Virtual worlds could become more compelling than physical existence. Why spend 30 years traveling through a distant solar system when an AI-generated universe can give you unlimited experiences in an afternoon? Immortality could therefore create a civilization where people live forever, but increasingly choose not to experience the real world. And then comes the most disturbing possibility. What happens when an immortal person decides they no longer want to live? If aging has been cured, suicide would no longer be merely a medical or psychological issue. It would become a fundamental question about autonomy. Would society allow someone to end an existence that could theoretically continue for thousands of years? Would governments regulate voluntary death? Would religions debate whether indefinite biological life changes the meaning of mortality? Would families try to stop loved ones from leaving? And if a person has lived for 800 years, who has the right to tell them that they must continue? For the first time, humanity would have to separate two concepts that had always been linked: living longer and wanting to live. The answer would not be simple. Some people would argue that indefinite life is humanity's greatest achievement. Others would argue that mortality gives life structure, because part of the reason moments matter is that they end. A sunset feels precious because it disappears. A childhood matters because it cannot be repeated. A conversation with a loved one matters because time cannot be recovered. If death becomes optional, does life become more meaningful because we have more time, or less meaningful because there is always tomorrow? No scientist can answer that, and perhaps this is where the story becomes less about technology and more about what it means to be human. The greatest transformation may not happen inside our cells. It may happen inside our definition of civilization. For thousands of years, humanity has built monuments because individuals disappear. We carve names into stone, write books, paint portraits, build temples, launch spacecraft, create companies, leave messages for people who will come after us. We do these things because we know we will not be here forever. But imagine a world where the person who writes the message can still be alive 1,000 years later. The monument changes meaning. The book changes meaning. The photograph changes meaning. Even history changes meaning. Because history is traditionally the story of the dead and the memory of the living. In an immortal civilization, history becomes something much stranger. It becomes the story of people who are still here. And eventually, humanity may encounter its ultimate challenge, not how to live forever, but how to make forever worth living. Perhaps the first immortal humans would be celebrated as heroes. Perhaps they would be feared. Perhaps governments would try to control them. Perhaps corporations would try to own the technology. Perhaps the rich would gain access first. Perhaps centuries would pass before immortality became available to everyone, and that delay could create one of the greatest inequalities in human history. A world divided between people who age and people who don't.
the first generation of immortal humans could become almost mythological.
Children might grow up knowing that somewhere in the world lives a person who was already an adult before their great-grandparents were born. And eventually, those children would ask the question every civilization eventually asks about its gods. Why do they get to live forever? That question could ignite political movements, religious movements, wars, revolutions, or perhaps something more hopeful, a new social contract. A civilization built around controlled population growth, shared resources, renewable energy, interplanetary settlement, and limits on concentrated power. A civilization where living longer does not mean owning more, where experience does not automatically mean authority, where ancient minds remain open to new generations, and where immortality is treated not as a privilege, but as a responsibility, because there is one fact we should not forget. Even if aging were eliminated, humanity would not become invincible. Asteroids could still strike, stars could still explode, planets could still become hostile. Machines could still fail, people could still make terrible decisions. Immortality would not end risk. It would simply give us more time to create consequences. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. If humans had 10,000 years to solve climate change, would we finally cooperate? If we had 1,000 years to explore the solar system, would we become wiser? If leaders could remain alive for centuries, would they become more responsible or more dangerous? If every human being knew that they might live for hundreds of years, would we become more patient? Would we stop fighting? Would we stop wasting resources? Would we finally think like a species rather than a generation? Or would immortality simply give humanity more time to make the same mistakes? Perhaps the answer depends on something technology cannot manufacture: wisdom. Because extending the human lifespan does not automatically extend human maturity. A civilization can become older without becoming wiser. It can become more technologically advanced without becoming more ethical. It can conquer disease without conquering greed. It can reach Mars without learning how to live peacefully on Earth. And that is why immortality may never truly be a medical problem. It may be a civilization problem. Imagine the final scene. It is the year 3026. A spacecraft rises silently from Mars. Inside is a woman who was born centuries earlier. She remembers Earth before permanent lunar settlements. She remembers the first artificial intelligence systems. She remembers when humans still believed that living beyond 100 years was extraordinary.
She looks through the window. Mars is below her. Earth is a distant blue point.
And for the first time, she understands something her ancestors could never have known. Humanity did not defeat death. It negotiated with it. Death still exists. Accidents still happen. Wars still happen. Stars still burn out. Bodies can still be destroyed. But aging is no longer the clock that controls every human life. The old human timeline has been broken. Childhood, adulthood, old age, death. That pattern has guided our species since before written history. Now imagine removing the final step. Would humanity become free or trapped? Would we become explorers or hoarders? Would we become wiser or simply older? And perhaps the most unsettling question is not whether humans could become immortal. It is whether humans should, because every major technological revolution in history has forced us to confront the same uncomfortable truth. The ability to do something does not tell us whether we should do it. Fire changed humanity. Agriculture changed humanity. The printing press changed humanity. Industrialization changed humanity. Nuclear weapons changed humanity. Artificial intelligence may change humanity. But the ability to control aging could change something even deeper. It could change our relationship with time itself. For most of human history, we were temporary creatures living inside a permanent world. An immortal civilization would reverse that relationship. The world would become temporary, and we would become the ones who remain. For the first time, humanity would have to live with the consequences of its decisions for centuries. There would be no natural generation waiting to forget, no automatic reset. No guarantee that the people who created a problem would disappear before their descendants inherited it. The people who build the future might have to live in it, and perhaps that would be the greatest promise of immortality. Not that we live forever, but that we finally have enough time to become worthy of the future we keep imagining. If you enjoy thought-provoking stories about tomorrow, like this video, subscribe to Chronicle Nexus, and share it with someone curious about the future. Because the future may not be waiting for us. We may already be building it. And the question is no longer whether humanity will change. The question is what kind of humanity will survive long enough to see what comes next.